Thanks everyone for being with us today. It's quite an honor that we have a chance to speak to the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva. Such an important time, Madam Managing Director. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you.
You know, this really seems like your moment that you were meant to lead. So much of your fight, so much of your upbringing has been around equality and being a voice for the most poor in countries and for the most poor countries. You spoke about this crisis as a crisis like no other in a speech you gave not long ago. And you wrote on LinkedIn earlier this month, a crisis often brings out the best in people. This is happening already. You are approaching this from a position of optimism, and I'm hoping you can tell us why.
Well, it is really a crisis like no other. It is massive with great deal of uncertainty, truly global. We have now 170 countries finishing 2020 with smaller economies than they started the year. But it is also response like no other. And I would say opportunity like no other. In terms of response, what we have seen is remarkable. In very short period of time, countries lifted up their fiscal measures to prevent people, especially the most vulnerable, falling into the midst of this crisis in despair. And central banks have poured enormous amount of liquidity. All of this has put a floor under the economy that we consciously, like never before, put on standstill. These actions have been well coordinated within countries and actually well coordinated among countries. And they benefited not only their direct recipients, but also they had positive spillover impact for emerging economies. And let me give you one example. In March, I was so worried of what I have seen as outflows of capital from developing countries. Yeah. $100 billion leaving in weeks. In April and May, countries could go back to markets, raise money because of this abundance of liquidity. But only countries with good fundamentals. This is one hearing that we are putting from the crisis. Do the right thing in good times so you can face bad times. Sure. And then why I think of the crisis also as an opportunity. Because we will have to put into action massive fiscal stimulus to revitalize economies everywhere. And when we do that, it is our chance to make it so that the world on the other side is greener. In other words, we invest in the right things, in a low carbon, climate resilient growth. It is smarter. We make sure that digital is for everybody. It is not just for you and me and the privileged in advanced economies. And most importantly, that it is fairer, that we put distributional impact as we move forward in a way that protects our society from the most terrible scarring, the scarring of poverty and inequality. And I hear in many countries, Europe, New Zealand, in some developing countries, voices that say, yes, we can do it. We can make this to be the great revival of our times, rather than the great reversal that it may risk to be.
That's a great way to put it, the great revival, not the great reversal. And you say we can do it. What must we do? What must the US do as a leading economy in this? And what must the global economy do to make sure that we come out of this not the same on the other side, but in fact more equal? I mean, you for so long have been a fighting voice for gender equality. Melinda Gates told me a few weeks ago how concerned she is that this COVID crisis will set women back further. And the data is already showing that it is affecting women more. More of the housework, the childcare is falling on women. There is concern that when we do go back to work, if you will, many women won't be able to go back if there's not adequate childcare. How do we ensure that it is more equitable on the other side?
Well, we can only do it if we are focused on the policy measures that put in place will shift us in the right direction. It is not going to fall from the sky. And we know what these policy measures ought to be. One, we know that for us to be in a better place, growth has to resume. We are not going to have a more prosperous world if we fail to inject this critical momentum of growth that is not only happening, but is happening in a more inclusive manner. In other words, pay attention to the small and medium size companies. Make sure they don't go massively in bankruptcy. Protecting the vibrancy of the economy is truly paramount for everybody. But then make the second step. Think about measures that can gear us towards more equality. One of these measures, we know it, is how we spread the responsibilities for our future. Let me give you one example in this crisis. Digital is definitely the winner. By any standard, it looks like the digital transformation is being accelerated by the pandemic. Some experts say possibly by 2 or more years. Well, if digital is the big winner, how is this winner going to help that we don't have parts of our society falling behind? We have to think about the role of taxation in a world in which parts of the economy are going to do much better. And we know that we have people that do much better. But then also how we put the right incentives for companies to be inclusive for women, for people of different minorities out there. We know that this issue of inequality in the US, it is right now about racial inequality, but it is broader than that. And we know that we have learned what are the policies that can be put in place for the world to be more inclusive. And last but not least, let's not forget that together, more integrated, we do much better. There is one worry on my mind, which is the fate of trade in the post is still early to say, but in this world out there, we ought to protect our ability to get richer because we collaborate economically and we trade with each other. It's so simple. The lesson of history is so simple. When we trade, costs of what we produce go down, incomes go up, and poverty retreats.
Sure. I mean, the US has seen the example when you talk about the Great Depression and how it was exacerbated by increased tariffs and Smoot-Hawley and increased protectionism. And you've been warning for a while now against that increased protectionism. I'd like to talk about equality and build on that a bit, because we all know every study shows if you have more diverse boards and more diverse leadership, meaning, equal number of women and a minority employment at the top and on the board that actually reflects the society in which your corporation operates, they do better, right? But that's not what we have. And the discussion I'm having with CEOs now constantly every day on our program is, so what are you going to do about it? Ursula Burns, the first Black woman to run a Fortune 500 company, Xerox, told me she is fielding calls left and right from white men leading companies asking her what to do. They have the power to make these changes. You're in favor of quotas. It's controversial, but you think we're at that point where we need quotas for diversity.
I'm very much in favor of something that drives accountability for diversity. You can call it quotas, you can call it targets, you can call it goals. Doesn't really matter. What matters is that there is discipline to measure where we are making progress in the direction of diversity. The reason I personally am in favor of setting a quota at senior management level is that unless you get the top of an organization to look like the world, it is very difficult to lift up the bottom. And it is so doable. I was in the European Commission, set a, we call it target. Okay, let's use this softer word, target, 40% women in senior management, when the percentage was around 4, 5. And my first meeting on this topic, my staff gave me 15-minute presentation as to why this cannot be done. Cannot be done, too difficult. So I sent them back. I said, very interesting. Now go back and come with a presentation that tells us how it is going to be done, because it will be done. And Poppy, it is done. So that determination, leadership determination, means to not zero on obstacles except for the purpose of overcoming them.
Mm. I like that. I like that approach. Go back and tell me why you can do it. I'm going to try that. I'd like to spend a bit of time focusing on solutions in your mind. We're seeing it play out in the streets of America right now, but this is a global crisis in terms of racism and racial inequality, and what we're maybe finally going to do about it. When you look at the numbers out of the Federal Reserve just in the United States from just a few years ago, 2016, the median net worth of a white household was 10 times that of a Black household. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where this all began with the killing of George Floyd. And I grew up seeing the disparity there that is replicated across the country. And I wonder what solutions you think there are to that from the ground level up, not just elevating minorities, which we need to do in corporate America, but what else is our responsibility at this point?
Well, it is our responsibility to recognize the value of diversity and make sure that we talk about this value of diversity in all possible matrices. For me, in my job, it is the economics of diversity. Why is it that more diverse societies, companies do better? And show it relentlessly, stay on message, repeat it as many times as it would take for the message to sink in. We also have a huge responsibility to recognize that inequality, exclusion, it affects everybody. Even the people who are doing well are doing less well because the society so stupidly doesn't tap into the talent of all its people. And of course, the social fabric is impacted in a way that certainly diminishes our quality of life. And I am more in favor of making this case not just on the basis of values, although values matter. Who we are matters, but to make it in a way that people can say, oh, this is actually good for me, even if I am from the privileged minority. Longer term, I'm better off if society is inclusive. And the research of the IMF is very interesting in this regard. We have shown that more inequality, all other things equal, actually damages growth prospects, and in the end is a cost that one way or another societies bear.
Could you speak to the poorer nations out there and about our responsibility for emerging economies? For people who don't know, you're the first person from an emerging market economy to lead the IMF. And you have a unique perspective on this, watching your mother, for example, in the 90s lose her wealth, her savings overnight in the currency crisis. I mean, we have seen actions, we have seen the suspension of debt service payments to these countries, but it's going to take a long time. I mean, if the Federal Reserve is saying we're not going to get back to normal for a matter of years here, and that's the United States, for emerging economies, I think it may be even more protracted.
Yeah. Well, I take my origins, where I come from, extremely seriously as part of my responsibility in this crisis to have not only analytical understanding of problems countries and people face, but also empathy and emotional understanding, and making sure that my institution leans forward with everything we have, especially to support the most vulnerable. Poppy, in 7 weeks, we have provided 70 financial lifelines to countries that so much need it. And this has never happened in the history of the IMF. And as we have done it, normally we would have complicated story of conditionalities. This time, we ask only 2 things. Please pay your doctors, your nurses, make sure your hospitals work, and please help the most vulnerable parts of your economy and your most vulnerable people. When I look at the future that affects all of us, the uncertainty within which we operate, but the future that is going to be, it would take time for us to rebound fully. We are projecting 2021 only partial recovery from this crisis. Of course, I worry about the countries and the people that are least suited, and therefore what we do is to mobilize attention to these people. And I want to praise the United States in the $2 trillion package that Congress approved. There were also components to make the IMF stronger, to give more resources to development banks. And that is formidable. We have to do more of this, acts of solidarity. And then my job is to make sure that the taxpayers' money, the country's own and those that come in support, they are targeting a more productive, pro-growth, but also pro-poor development. You said when we come back to where we were, I actually hope that we will build forward, that the future would be fixing some of the problems we had in our past.
I certainly hope so too, especially for the little ones you see behind me. My 2- and 4-year-old, I hope that they are in a world that is not the same now, but more equitable, certainly. Let's talk about that in a more holistic approach, if you would. Not just financial targets and getting GDP back to where it was pre-COVID crisis, but is there a value in economic policy makers prioritizing more holistic targets, right? Like social and environmental targets. You talked about a greener world, and not just growth targets.
Definitely, we have to think of sustainable and inclusive growth for the future. Sustainable meaning that we recognize our Earth is not unlimited, and the pressures we have put, especially in terms of climate change, unsustainable. For those who don't like the pandemic, you're not going to like the climate crisis either. It would be destructive to a point that may reverse poverty dramatically. I actually see that as a critical objective of the growth of the future, to be one that is low carbon and climate resilient. And we also have to think of growth as being smart in a sense that it is based on investing in the most precious capital we have, which is us, investing in people. education, healthcare, social protection. These are not feel-good spendings. These are hardcore investments if we are to have an economy, strong economy to rely on. When we had the global financial crisis, as you remember, at that time, we zeroed on the banking sector and we actually fixed it. We now have banking system that is much more resilient, stronger buffers, better performance, and it helps us in this crisis. Looking into the lessons from the pandemic, we sure have to recognize that having automatic social protection stabilizers is critically important. Having a health system that would prevent from another shock, hugely expensive in the future, but also having education that creates equality of opportunities for all children, for yours, for my granddaughter and my grandson, who I want to see growing in a world that is prosperous, sustainable, fair.
Well, and on the education front, because I agree it is the most formidable crisis that we face, and it's not one that my children face and your grandchild faces. We have the means to provide the education that they need. I worry about so many kids now that because they don't have connection to broadband aren't even learning when school is not in session, let alone getting proper nutrition. You brought up the banking sector, and I guess I would just end on this because, you know, we stood up the banking sector in the United States in the financial crisis, and we said there will be stress tests. And if you are not prepared for them, and if you cannot sustain yourself, you cannot stay in business. But we haven't done that for the education sector. What if there was that bar and that test for every school in this country and around the world to say, you must meet these standards to educate our children? I wonder how you think about solutions for education that has been arguably the most formidable challenge.
One, I take pride that the IMF invented stress testing for the banking system, and now you are challenging us to think how to stress test for quality of human capital. I would take that. I accept the challenge, Poppy. Right. Two, what we see in different parts of the world paints a picture of where we should go. If you take the top 10 countries in PISA, 8 of them are from Asia. Sorry, 7 of them are from Asia. At the top are countries that have taken education of children extremely seriously, and that they put that quality, not just quantity, quality of education at the top of their priority list. And there are countries that are doing better on many other indicators. It is actually very depressing in my part of the world, in Europe, to have 20% of the 15-year-old to be basically illiterate and innumerical in Europe. In my country, Bulgaria, long traditions of education being a priority, even worse, some almost 40%. That cannot be a foundation for development in a digital, automated, very fast-moving world. And therefore, we do have to put stress tests for how is our educational system developing. And as I said, embraced, I will, when I come next to you, we will talk about that. How can it be done?
I appreciate that. I look forward to us meeting in person one day. And I'm very grateful. I think we all are for your leadership now at the IMF. As I said, I think you are the right person and you were born for this moment in the world. So thank you so much, Madam Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva. We really appreciate you being here today.